Before we get into the next session, I would like to do a special shout out to some special VIPs who have just arrived. Lucy Hughes Turnbull, AO, and the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, AC. Welcome. You picked a really good time to come in. So we're now turning our attention to health and education precincts in the West, and for our next panel titled Cancer Cures and Nobel Prizes. As I introduce our panellists, I invite them to make their way up onto the stage. Stephen Brady, Managing Director, TAFE New South Wales. Amanda Larkin, Chief Executive, South Western Sydney Local Health District. Dr. Zoe Terpening, Director Strategy and Precincts, UNSW, and our Provocateur, Richard Alcock, AO, Chairman, Western Sydney Local Health District. I should also say that we were lucky to have Richard and Amanda join us in 2019 on the East London Study Tour, so I'm so glad the band's back together. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, when we were given the title of this panel, I think all of the four panellists took a deep breath in, Curing Cancer and Nobel Prizes. And so what we did, because as you know, only 15 Australians have ever won the Nobel Prize. The last Nobel Prize was awarded more than 10 years ago to an American, Brian Schmidt, at the ANU. So what we thought was that we would use the title as a metaphor for our ignition, the theme of today's conference, for our ambition, to talk about where our young entrepreneurs, innovators, breakthrough researchers in health and education are going to take our incredible facilities that our Treasurer and our Minister for Western Sydney have talked about today. So we've made the investment of $3 or $4 billion in our infrastructure, and now's the time for investment in our people. So Zoe, are we ready to announce our intent to win the Nobel Prize?
Why not, Richard? I think if anything's been clear today from what we've heard is that Western Sydney might be the city of the future, Steve, but I'd offer opportunity. I've heard a lot of opportunity in the discussions today, and I think of Nobel Prizes, and 15 there may be, but I also think that there's some common elements to that, and I'll take you back to when I was a young child. So I was a 17-year-old in southwest Sydney. I was a science nerd, don't do science now, but loved it as a kid. And I had an industry colleague who I'd met through a Rotary Club take interest in me. And he actually sponsored me through a local Rotary Club, and I ended up at the Nobel Prize ceremony in Stockholm. So perhaps my perspective on this particular question is a little biased. And I was put in a room with a number of Nobel laureates and given the opportunity to ask them questions. I've never used any of that information to date in my life until this moment. And I remember distinctly what the themes were that they told me were really critical to getting that Nobel Prize. One of them was a bold vision. They all had a vision of what they wanted to achieve. It wasn't a vision of decades ago, it was a vision of what they saw in the future. And I think that's something that we really see evident in Western Sydney. I remember one particular guy telling me about him pushing the boundaries and being a little bit antagonistic in his work in order to really kind of fail quickly. And I think that's another element for Greater Western Sydney that's been a real asset, certainly that I've seen in the last couple of years, is a willingness for different groups to come together and try something new, and it doesn't always work, but sometimes it does, and then we innovate and we change. And so I remember that distinctly being one of those themes, and certainly alive and well in Western Sydney. And the last thing I remember in broad terms was their reliance on partnership. So none of them said that they did anything alone. They always did it with other people. And I think in Western Sydney, you can talk about partnerships, but it's not just people working together. It's a real generosity of partnership. I sit in health and education precincts where there's 10 people around the table from different organisations, and we're all happy to talk about a problem and come up with solutions. And I think the generosity of partnership in Western Sydney can't be understated. So yes, Richard, I think it is possible.
Steve, recognising the huge breadth and depth of the health industry, what are the educational pathways and new ways of bringing skills on that you're leading in the TAFE organisation?
Thanks, Richard. I don't know that TAFE's ever produced a Nobel Prize winner. I'm pretty sure not. But we have produced a lot of people have contributed in very diverse ways to the economy and society. So for us, when we look at Greater Western Sydney, we see incredible growth, and particularly in the health sector, which we got Lloyd Economics to do a little bit of work for us, and they estimate over the next 3 years there'll be an additional 13,849 jobs in the health sector. Trust an economist to come down to 49, but the importance of that is not just the traditional health roles, where we obviously do a lot of training for allied health services, for enrolled nurses, for a whole range of people who are starting their careers or changing the direction of their careers in the health sector. We also work with some of the emerging technologies. So we're seeing more and more need as technology becomes more directly involved in everyday care, that our health professionals need to have some understanding of programming. We need more technicians on the floor. We need more people who understand robotics, for instance. So we're seeing this change quite significantly, and so we've been doing quite a bit of work around partnering with providers of technology into the health sector. So one example we've got is we've partnered with New South Wales Health Pathology, Cognitive VR and Werfen to deliver a virtual reality point-of-care blood testing pilot. So that's a really great example of where we've used immersive technologies to move away from a model where you had 20 nurses standing around a station being talked to by one person, and then one of them getting to actually have the hands-on experience, to every single nurse got the opportunity to have that lifelike experience, and they didn't have to all come around the one spot at the same time. And so what you get is a distribution of training, an ability to have a hands-on experience, and an uplift in the ability of the healthcare provider and the technology provider to disseminate their technology into the community. So that's just one example. I think the other thing is, when we think about the growth in healthcare in Greater Western Sydney, yes, we've got our traditional health professions, and we've got a number of those that we're working with in the schools, where we've got a number of certificate programs where, whilst at school, the students are getting trained as part of their HSC. They're able then to exit straight into a job-ready situation, able to pick up and work in the health sector. We've got another program with Indigenous students, and a further program partnered with JP Morgan, where we're working with Indigenous students. So there's a range of ways we're working with the school system to bring people straight into the health system. But I think beyond those traditional pathways and the technology changes, there's also the recognition of the size and scale of health as a sector, and what that means in terms of other types of roles that you need, whether that's in logistics, in administration, finance. We should remember that there's an enormous support system that sits outside each health professional, and that those roles are really critically important as well.
Amanda, you're one of 3 CEOs responsible for delivering public health services to 2.5 million people, a workforce in aggregate of about 35,000 people. What role do you see precincts in the way in which we're going to project our health and education jobs of the future? And are they going to be the game changer that we hope that they'll be?
Thanks, Richard. Can I just start with a few reflections? Because I just think it puts us in context around the West. And I think today really gives us the opportunity to think really carefully, and Zoe kind of touched on it a bit. What is it about the West, and why are we really all really focused on it? As much as there's land and opportunity and development out here, you know, the real kind of thinking and reflection around the West, though, is that there really is that idea of what we can achieve and what we can develop out here. And I think over the last couple of years with COVID, when we think about healthcare and healthcare delivery, and Steve, you know, you talked about it in relation to jobs and what we can do. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is health in a very different light. And so we all think of health, you know, as the big buildings that we build and the precincts that we'll develop. And truly, they are game changers for us. And I want to talk about that in a little bit. But what we've seen this last 2.5 years in health, and the West has been hit the hardest. So let's think about it. We have been hit the hardest by COVID. And why is that so? It's not just because of the nature of the large populations and whatever, but it's also the aggregate of the populations and the demographics, etc., that made it really difficult, and the transmission in the West was significant. And so the language I've always used is that, you know, we talk about health, and yet a pandemic, a public health, and we suddenly learned about what, you know, public health traces do, you know, and all those kind of people. That's what's brought us to our knees. So when we think about health, the precincts and what we're developing in the precincts have a great opportunity to change what we're doing out here. Jobs, the future of jobs, but it's not just about jobs. I mean, I hope when we talk to TAFE and the universities and our partners, it's about the careers of our kids. That's really what we want to be focused on, that we actually want to be able to give them a path to a different career, or a career that they choose of themselves, rather than something, you know, that perhaps their dad, no disrespect to the dads, and mums and whatever did. So that they can choose whichever. And in health, could I say, health has got the most amazing opportunity. Don't think of hospitals as built environments like they are at the moment. That's where we are today. But in time to come, the way we do health, the way things are delivered, the logistics side, you know, people used to have open surgery, we now do keyhole surgery. All of those things changed, but it changed all the nature of how people worked, the kinds of jobs and the kinds of people who work in health. You know, the digitisation of health, all of those things have a fundamental impact. But come back to my point about public health. Public health really is the game changer in the West, and I really want you to think about it, and precincts have a role. Yes, it's about how our educational partners and health, and especially industry, work together, and we're very poor at it. I just want to put that out there. We don't do it well, and there is a cultural and a whole range of different reasons why we don't do it well. And I work with Zoe, and we are trying really hard to improve our environment there. But it's public health where there are opportunities. And in public health, I'm talking about things like, it is 5 degrees hotter in the West. Does that influence the health conditions that we deal with, the way people work, melanomas, all of those kinds of things? I could kind of expand on it. But it's those public health issues that we need to be really aware of, really cognizant about, and that they're the things of the future that we need to think about, that the changes we can make. The precincts bring together the opportunity of education, health and industry to really deliver care differently. But I think the challenge for us, Richard, is to think really carefully. We think about the precincts as individual sites, and the reality is, like it or not, is there a level of competitiveness? Well, there is. And if you work with clinicians, people, the nature of those people who win the Nobel Prizes, they're hungry, they're ambitious, and they've got big egos. And I mean that positively, not negatively. So if you put them in the precinct area, there needs to be that competitive edge against the precincts. That's just the reality of how we work and how we operate in health, can I say. But the opportunity is for the precincts across, especially the Western region, to work in a real collaborative way. Not just that we work together, but how do we actually leverage off one another, build off one another, both in terms of the infrastructure and engagement, But also, how do we do that industry engagement much better than what we do at the moment, so that when we're saying to the kids of the future who have come through TAFE or have come through universities, here is a smorgasbord of jobs that you can consider, here is a smorgasbord of education, and we're going to partner with you in terms of being able to do that.
Christopher will remember that when we went to East London, one of the things that really struck us was that the Londoners themselves didn't see the future potential of East London, as well as foreign capital, foreign expertise, who could see it all. So Zoe, do you think we're too modest? Is the Western Sydney way to focus on the task, deliver before we talk about it, be modest? You know, is now the time, if we're in a very competitive field for global expertise, for smart immigration, for capital, do we need to talk our talk better?
Thanks, Richard. I think storytelling is becoming increasingly important in Western Sydney. We often talk about it in our governance structures of how we're going to tell the story of what we're all trying collectively to do. There's so much work that's being done by such a diverse number of organisations, but how will our future students, in the case of universities, know about those opportunities and what we're trying to create? And so I think that storytelling element's becoming a really important piece of the puzzle for us. The other element that I think is becoming, just to take a slight detour on the question, that I think is becoming really critically important is how we as a collective all work together, as Amanda said, across each of the precincts to create a narrative and a vision that's shared, particularly for the Greater Western Sydney region. And I think when you do that, you start to see the gaps and where some of these things come unstuck. And I'll give you an example in Liverpool. So we have a really vibrant sort of entrepreneurial kind of culture in the Liverpool Innovation Precinct, and we undertook a couple of years ago to really upscale some of the startups in that precinct, and we went from sort of no startups to about 70 startups. And we got to a point where they really needed to go on to the next stage of their journey of innovation, but didn't really have that piece of the pie at that time in Liverpool. And so what we see then is these people that then go to other areas of Sydney to try and get those services. And so I think the benefit of us all sort of sitting around and telling these stories about what we're doing in Greater Western Sydney is we are starting to identify where those opportunities to fill those gaps are that really transform not only the future workforce that we have in Western Sydney, our talent pipeline, and the educational opportunities that people have in the region. And so, yes, if you can help us solve with our incredible number of startups in Liverpool, you know, that's something that's a really important thing for us to retain that talent, not just for the benefit of Liverpool, but for the entire Western Sydney region.
Amanda?
Thanks, Richard, because I just think we need to really understand about the culture of the West. And I think once you really understand it, then you can reflect on the question, you know, Richard, that you said, you know, do we not, you know, promote is not quite the right word, but put ourselves out there. And I think, and I will come back to COVID. Why? Because it paints a whole picture that I think we ought to think about really carefully. What happened in COVID is that, and the language was used in the media, you know, the West is the engine. And it was kind of nearly seen to be negative rather than positive. And I want you to really rethink that. The West is the engine of New South Wales. The West has the capability of delivering enormously in so many different areas and has attracted over the last couple of years, you know, your universities, your educational institutions who are linking up to deliver enormously, you know, different things than what they've done previously. But Richard, we're not good at putting it out there. We get on, we do the work, you know, we deliver on very big projects. You can see huge things happening in the West. But what we are not strong at times is actually putting ourselves out there and really putting the message about what we've been able to do and what we've been able to deliver. And we need to do that much better. I think not just one or two of us, collectively as a group, the voice needs to be very strong.
Stephen, we talked earlier today about micro-credentialing and lifelong learning. What does the interface of lifelong learning in health and education precincts look like in the future?
I think Anthony touched on it a little bit earlier when he talked about Meadowbank. So one of our most recent school developments where we're side by side with the TAFE. Not only is it side by side with the TAFE, but it's with our new Institute of Advanced Technology for Digital, which is a facility we're building right now, which will bring together industry, universities and TAFE in the one facility. But as I said, built right alongside a high school, so we get that integration from school through vocational and into tertiary, but working alongside industry. So really understanding industry's needs. I've heard people talking about partnership quite a lot and partnering with industry, and that's absolutely critical if we're going to be delivering the skills that are needed for tomorrow's workforce. And so as we see the rate of change happening in the economy and, you know, certainly the health sector with the way technology is impacting is right at the forefront of that, then we see the need for a different type of learning. We're seeing the need for a much more agile learning system, one which can respond much more quickly to change as that technology starts to impact the way existing trained workers do their jobs, but also as new skills are required to come in. So we're seeing that we need to move outside of our traditional very structured training packages to where we need to be able to work closely with industry to provide bite-sized pieces of knowledge that can help people to very rapidly upskill to add to their existing skill base, not to totally retrain, but to just keep adding to their skill base, perhaps help them to move sideways or move up, but they're bite-sized pieces which, under micro-credentialing, you can then start to stack and potentially lead to a full qualification or a pathway into a higher education degree. Not only going from vocational up into higher ed, but it also comes back the other way. So we've been partnering with quite a number of the universities to provide reverse articulation, which allows some of their people who are studying in technology spaces or construction to come back and get some of the more practical hands-on skills that you can get through vocational education, which actually helps with their understanding of the application of the technologies that they're developing. And also, of course, when they develop these technologies and they get deployed into the workforce, they'll inevitably break and someone needs to be able to fix them, which is more of a TAFE type of role. So for us, we're trying to work much more closely with the school system, get young students involved much earlier with vocational education, so they start to understand the pathways. 70% of school students don't go to university. So we need to be able to show them that there are really strong and meaningful careers available for them. But that training has to lead to a job. It can't be just a credential for the sake of a credential. And so that's where it's really important that we're partnering with health and other organisations within the growth of Greater Western Sydney to make sure that we're delivering the right skills that are relevant, but then providing the agility to change over time. So it is a true lifelong learning proposition so that we can continue to support the development of Greater Western Sydney.
Amanda, you lead a very large organisation, approximately 15,000 employees. Health is a very exacting profession. How, as a CEO, do you promote a culture for innovation as well as precision in your organisation?
I think one of the critical elements that people need to understand about health is that health's primary role is about care, and about care in the broadest context, from population health that you saw over COVID right through to trauma, etc. And we deal with all those elements. But it actually has two other elements, Richard. And the other elements we are absolutely linked with our universities and with TAFE around training and education. People come to us to do their undergraduate degrees, they do TAFE apprenticeships with us, and so that's an essential part of our role. But the other part is research. And the research and innovation is essential in terms of promoting and developing healthcare delivery. One of the things about healthcare is very evidence-based practice. And over COVID, if you listen to Kerry Chant's kind of 11 o'clock presses every day, and I do come back to it because it brought health very much to the forefront of all of our lives, could I say to you. She'd say, oh, we're doing this today, and then she'll say, oh, and then the next day she'd say, we're doing X. And everyone says, well, why is that happening? And I need to reflect to you, we were also saying the same thing, because in health, that's not how we operate. We operate on, we have a way of doing things. If we want to change it, we look at it, we evaluate it, we do some research around it, then we change our practice. So what's essential for us around how we work then is about research. We're always looking at what's the cutting edge, what's the change, who can we partner with, how can we develop an innovative way of doing it, etc. And it's central to the way that we work. So from my point of view as the CEO, as much as we have the critical role of care delivery and running the overall health services for communities, what's essential is that we develop and resource and we promote research and innovation in our organisations. And we do it, though, truly in partnership. We do it with our university partners, with industry, with other groups who will give us different ideas, different ways of doing things, and push that boundary all the time in terms of how we can deliver healthcare, in a different way for our communities. Yeah.
Zoe, as we reach the end of this session, would you just sketch out what you think a health and education precinct is going to look like in 10 years? Are we going to have aggregations of ethicists, technologists, philosophers? What are the skills of the future that are going to be prevalent in our health precincts?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think when we're spending, 29% of our budget on health and with projections of that being as high as sort of 38%, I think those wicked problems of health are going to require wicked new ways of working and wicked new teams. And I think our health and education precincts are, if anything, over the last couple of years have taught me just how important the non-medicine and health aspects are to the solutions that we need to deliver. And by that I mean, if we want to solve the problems of health at the university, our faculties of business, our faculties of arts, design and architecture, of all of those other elements are just as critical as our training institutions and groups around just medicine and health. And if I think of our experiences in some of our precincts in Western Sydney, it's interesting, I heard a TAFE colleague mention the other day that one of the greatest determinants in their area for what courses students would select was whether or not they could get to the site. Now, my heart sank. They're not making a selection of education based on whether or not they want to do the course. They're making a determination based on whether they can get there. And so I've partnered with Amanda and we're working on wayfinding and access in that particular region because that's what's going to solve the problems of health. So that sees me as a university backing a strategy that aligns with a different faculty, so a non-medicine and health faculty, to address these challenges. And I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see health and education precincts start to bring together all the elements that we have across all our organisations into these wicked new teams to really tackle these challenges that health is facing. And I think those opportunities are great in Western Sydney. As I said, I think Western Sydney is opportunity, and I think it's what we make of it. I see no other region where such a diverse number of stakeholders are coming together to try and work together to solve those challenges. So I'm excited by that.
So please thank our panellists, Dr. Zoe Terpening, Amanda Larkin and Stephen Brady.